In the spring of 1969, the British government placed an order for 52 McDonnell Douglas F-4 Phantom IIs. They came from St. Louis, Missouri. They wore RAF roundels, and they cost Britain £130 million, roughly £2.3 billion in today's money. The aircraft they were sent to replace was already flying, already scrambling, already intercepting Soviet bombers over the North Sea in the dark in all weathers at twice the speed of sound. It had been doing so for nearly a decade. It was British. It was faster than anything America had put into squadron service. And in the one performance category that defined Cold War air defense, the race from runway to altitude, it had beaten every aircraft NATO flew. The men who built it had done so with slide rules in a factory in Preston, Lancashire, on a budget the Pentagon would have considered a rounding error. But the Treasury had other ideas. And Whitehall, as it so often did, made its decision not on what the aircraft could do, but on what continuing to develop it would cost. So Britain bought American. Again. But the real story of the English Electric Lightning is not the procurement decision that ended it. It is the story of what happens when a nation builds something genuinely extraordinary, and then for 28 years refuses to give it the tools to survive. Every week, we tell the stories behind the aircraft, the ships, and the decisions that shaped British defense. Give the video a like and subscribe if you want to keep hearing them. The story begins not in a Whitehall conference room and not in a ministry file. It begins on a runway at Boscombe Down, Wiltshire, in the summer of 1954. By 1947, the Royal Air Force had a problem it could not ignore. The Second World War had ended 2 years earlier, but the strategic picture over Europe was already darkening. The Soviet Union had captured German aeronautical engineers, German jet engine designs, and German wind tunnel data. Within months, Moscow was flying its own jet fighters. Within years, it would be flying bombers capable of reaching British cities from bases in the western USSR, fast, high, and in formation. Fighter Command's answer to that threat in 1947 was the Gloucester Meteor, a fine aircraft for its time. But the Meteor was subsonic, slow to climb, and designed for a war that was already over. Against a swept-wing Soviet bomber flying at 40,000 feet and 500 knots, it was not a weapon system. It was a gesture. The Air Ministry knew it, and in 1947 it issued Specification F-23/49, a requirement for a supersonic research aircraft that might eventually point the way toward a genuine high-altitude interceptor. The word "eventually" did a great deal of work in that document. English Electric received the contract. The company had been founded in 1918, formed from the merger of several electrical engineering firms based across the English Midlands and the North. Its headquarters sat in Strand, London, but its manufacturing heart was in Preston, Lancashire, a town whose economy, by the early 1950s, was becoming inseparable from the fate of whatever English Electric was building at Warton Aerodrome, 5 miles to the west. English Electric was not in the conventional sense an aircraft company. Before the war, it had built tram cars, turbines, and transformers. During the war, it had manufactured Halifax bombers under license, assembling other people's designs with disciplined precision. It had never designed a frontline combat aircraft of its own. That changed when they hired W.E.W. Teddy Petter. Petter had come from Westland Aircraft, where he had led the design of the Lysander Army Cooperation aircraft and the Welkin high-altitude fighter. He was meticulous, demanding, and possessed of a rare engineering instinct, the ability to look at a performance requirement and identify, before the calculations were complete, which design decisions would matter and which would not. He arrived at English Electric in 1944. He was given a small team, a cleared facility at Warton, and a brief that amounted to build us something fast. What Petter and his team produced first was the Canberra, a twin-jet bomber of exceptional altitude performance that entered RAF service in 1951 and was eventually built under license in the United States by Martin Aircraft. The fact that an American company paid to build a British design was noted in Preston with considerable satisfaction. But the Canberra was a bomber. Petter's real interest, and the Air Ministry's growing urgency lay in the interceptor problem. In 1948, the requirement sharpened. The Air Ministry issued Operational Requirement 53, later refined through several revisions calling for a supersonic fighter capable of reaching 50,000 feet in under 5 minutes and engaging Soviet bombers before they reached their release point. The specification demanded a top speed in excess of Mach 1.5. It demanded an operational ceiling that the Meteor could not approach. And it demanded that the aircraft be ready for squadron service within a decade. 3 design teams submitted proposals: English Electric Fairey Aviation and Hawker Aircraft. Fairey proposed the elegant but complex FD-2, a delta-wing research aircraft that would later set a world air speed record but was never developed into a fighter. Hawker submitted early concepts that would eventually evolve into the Hunter, a superb substitute Nick aircraft, but one that could not meet the supersonic requirement. English Electric's submission was the P-1, a design so unconventional that several senior Air Ministry officials initially refused to believe it would fly. The development contract awarded to English Electric in 1950 was valued at approximately £900,000, roughly £32 million at today's prices. It was, by the standards of what it would eventually produce, an almost absurdly modest sum. The first prototype, the P-1A, was built at Wharton and transported by road to the Royal Aircraft Establishment at Boscombe Down, Wiltshire, for initial flight trials. It flew for the first time on the 4th of August, 1954, with Wing Commander Roland Beaumont at the controls. Beaumont was one of the most experienced test pilots in Britain, a wartime Typhoon and Tempest pilot with a reputation for extracting the true character of an aircraft on its first flight, rather than simply confirming it could fly. On that first flight, the P-1A exceeded Mach 1 in level flight. No British aircraft had ever done that before. Petter had left English Electric by then. He departed in 1950, following a dispute over the direction of the company's aviation division, and would later lead the design of the Falan Gnat. His successor as chief designer was Frederick Page, a quieter man, but an equally precise one who would guide the Lightning through every subsequent development phase. The Air Ministry had its answer. The question now was what they were willing to do with it. To understand what English Electric had built, it helps to begin with the problem they were solving. An interceptor's entire purpose is time. From the moment a radar controller calls a scramble to the moment the fighter's weapons are within range of their target, every second matters. A Soviet Tupolev Tu-16 Badger, cruising at 40,000 feet and 500 knots, covers roughly 8 nautical miles per minute. Miss your intercept window by 90 seconds, and the bomber has already passed its release point. The weapon is already falling. The city is already lost. Speed at altitude matters, but climb rate, the ability to get from the runway to the intercept altitude before the target arrives, matters more. This was the problem English Electric solved, and the solution was radical. Most fighter aircraft of the era mounted their engines side by side in the fuselage. 2 engines, 2 intakes, 2 exhaust pipes arranged horizontally. English Electric did something different. They stacked the 2 Rolls-Royce Avon turbojet engines vertically, one above the other, in the center of the fuselage. The lower engine fed through a ventral intake below the nose. The upper engine fed through 2 intakes set into the wing roots, both exhausted through a single combined jet pipe at the tail. The result was a fuselage so narrow, it appeared almost impossible to believe it contained 2 engines. The Lightning's frontal cross-section, the area of the aircraft facing into the airstream, was smaller than that of many single-engine fighters. Less frontal area meant less drag. Less drag with 2 Avons at full reheat meant acceleration and climb performance that no contemporary aircraft could match. Reheat, known in American terminology as afterburner, is the process by which additional fuel is injected directly into the exhaust stream behind the turbine, igniting in the jet pipe and producing a dramatic, if fuel-hungry, surge of additional thrust. On the Lightning, both Avons could be lit in reheat simultaneously. The combined thrust in that configuration reached approximately 30,000 pounds from an aircraft that, fully fueled and armed, weighed around 41,000 pounds at takeoff. The thrust-to-weight ratio this produced was for 1954 extraordinary. In practical terms, it meant the Lightning could climb at an initial rate exceeding 50,000 feet per minute, a figure so steep that pilots described early flights not as climbs, but as something closer to being fired from a gun. From brakes off to 40,000 feet in under 3 minutes. In the interceptor arithmetic of the Cold War, that was not an advantage. It was a different category of aircraft altogether. Top speed in the hands of later development variants reached Mach 2.0 in level flight. Some manufacturers' documents suggest Mach 2.27 under specific test conditions, though program records indicate Mach 2.0 as the reliable operational figure. At that speed, the Lightning was faster than any aircraft then in frontline service with the United States Air Force in the European theater. The wings were swept at 60 degrees a sharper angle than most contemporaries, chosen specifically to minimize wave drag at transonic and supersonic speeds. This gave the Lightning its distinctive appearance, a narrow, almost needle-like fuselage, a broad delta-adjacent wing, and an undercarriage so tightly packaged that the main wheels retracted inward into the thin wing with very little clearance to spare. Ground crews at RAF Leuchars and RAF Wattisham learned quickly that the Lightning required careful, methodical handling. It was not a forgiving aircraft on the ground. In the air, it rewarded precision with performance that seemed to belong to a later decade. The armament, however, was where the compromises began. The production Lightning F, one which entered RAF service with 74 Squadron at RAF. Coltershall in June 1960 carried 2 de Havilland Firestreak infrared homing missiles, early generation weapons with a narrow acquisition cone that required the pilot to approach the target from behind and below within a restricted angle before the seeker head could lock. Against a formation of Soviet bombers flying straight and level, this was manageable. Against a maneuvering target or in a head-on intercept scenario, it was a significant limitation. 2 missiles. No gun in the initial variants, no beyond visual range capability, and a fuel load so constrained by the space consumed by the stacked engines that combat radius. The distance the Lightning could fly out, fight, and return was measured not in hundreds of miles, but in tens. Approximately 150 nautical miles in the interceptor role under operational conditions before the pilot needed to be thinking about recovery. The test program at Boscombe Down and at the Aeroplane and Armament Experimental Establishment ran from 1954 through 1959 with successive prototype variants, the P-1A, the P-1B, and finally the pre-production Lightning accumulating flight hours and expanding the performance envelope. 19 prototype and pre-production airframes were built. The P-1B broke Mach 2 for the first time in November 1958. The airframe held together, the engines performed. The aerodynamics, though demanding, proved controllable in the hands of trained pilots. What the test program also revealed was the fuel problem. Every performance gain came at a cost measured in gallons per minute. At full reheat, the Lightning consumed fuel at a rate that made the North Sea feel like an ocean and the UK air defence region feel very small indeed. Subsequent variants attempted to address this. The F-3 introduced the more powerful Avon 301 engines. The F-6. The definitive production variant added a greatly enlarged ventral fuel tank beneath the fuselage and overwing ferry tanks that gave the aircraft an almost comical external appearance, a thoroughbred racehorse fitted with saddlebags. The F-6 also introduced the improved Red Top missile, a more capable infrared seeker with a wider acquisition angle. These were meaningful improvements, but they were additions to a fundamentally constrained design, not solutions to the underlying problem that no one in the ministry had been willing to fund away at the design stage. The decision was made. The program had its champion. Wing Commander Beaumont, who had flown the prototype on its first flight, became the Lightning's most effective advocate, demonstrating it at Farnborough air shows, flying it against American fighters at comparative trials, and making the case repeatedly and publicly that Britain had built something the world could not yet match. He was right, and for a time, that was enough. In June 1960, the Lightning entered RAF service with 74 Squadron at RAF Coltishall, Norfolk. The squadron's badge showed a tiger. Its pilots, within weeks of converting from the Hawker Hunter, were flying an aircraft that made the Hunter feel like a different era of aviation because it was. The transition was not gentle. The Lightning demanded everything a pilot had. Its acceleration in reheat was violent enough to induce spatial disorientation in pilots unaccustomed to it. Its approach speed was high. Its fuel state, always tight, required constant management. The margin between a normal recovery and a flame-out approach was narrow enough that Lightning pilots developed an almost obsessive relationship with their fuel gauges. Instructors at the Lightning Conversion Unit at RAF Middleton St. George described the aircraft in terms that were simultaneously admiring and cautionary. It would, they said, kill an inattentive pilot with complete indifference. Those who mastered it regarded it with something close to reverence. Between 1960 and 1965, the Lightning equipped 7 frontline RAF squadrons in the UK Air Defence role and 2 squadrons in RAF Germany. In Britain, 74 Squadron at Coltishall, 56 Squadron at Wattisham, 111 Squadron at Wattisham, 23 Squadron at Lushars, 29 Squadron at Lochars, and later 5 Squadron and 11 Squadron, the latter 2 becoming the Lightning's longest-serving operators and its final custodians when the type was eventually retired. In Germany, 19 Squadron and 92 Squadron, both based at RAF Gütersloh, providing NATO's second Allied Tactical Air Force with its supersonic interceptor component on the Central Front. At peak production, 337 Lightnings were built across all variants, F1, F1A, F2, F2A, F3, F6, and the 2-seat T4 and T5 trainers. English Electric's Wharton facility, and later the British Aircraft Corporation plant that absorbed it following the 1960 industry rationalisation, sustained a workforce of several thousand across Preston and the surrounding Lancashire towns. Subcontractors spread the economic footprint further. Rolls-Royce in Derby, supplying the Avon engines de Havilland propellers at Hatfield, producing the Firestreak and Red Top missiles Ferranti. In Edinburgh, developing the airborne interception radar fitted to later variants. The Lightning was never used in combat by the Royal Air Force, but to describe its operational record as uneventful is to misunderstand what it was built to do. Its theatre was the North Sea. Its adversary was the Tupolev Tu-95 Bear, a Soviet long-range maritime patrol and signals intelligence aircraft that probed NATO's northern air defenses with methodical regularity throughout the 1960s, 1970s, and 1980s. The Bears flew from bases on the Kola Peninsula, transited around the North Cape of Norway, and descended toward the UK air defence region from the north and northwest. Their mission was not always to reach Britain. Often it was simply to make NATO scramble to force Fighter Command to reveal its radar coverage, its response times, its controller procedures, and its intercept geometry. The Lightning answered every call. Quick reaction alert. QRA was the mechanism. 2 aircraft armed and fueled, held at cockpit readiness at designated stations around the clock. At Lochars in Fife Binbrook in Lincolnshire and Wattisham in Suffolk. Lightning crews sat in their cockpits or in adjacent crew rooms connected to the operations center by direct telephone waiting. When the call came, the target was already on radar. The clock was already running. From the scramble order to wheels off was measured in seconds. The Lightning's Avons could be started and the aircraft rolling within 2 minutes of the alert. From wheels off to intercept altitude under 3 minutes. The exact number of QRA scrambles flown by Lightning crews during the Cold War has never been fully declassified. Program records and aircrew accounts suggest the figure runs to several hundred confirmed intercepts over the aircraft's operational life. Bear Ds on reconnaissance profiles. Bear Fs trailing sonar buoys toward the GIUK, gap occasional. Tupolev, 216. Badgers probing the eastern approaches. Each intercept followed the same geometry climb. Hard acquire the contact on radar, close to visual range formate, on the Soviet aircraft's wingtip and hold position long enough for the navigator in the bear's glazed nose to photograph you photographing him. It was cold, professional, and relentless. And the Lightning was precisely the right aircraft for it. In the air, defense exercises that NATO ran annually across the Central Front and the Northern Approaches exercises with designations like Elder Forest and Forthright, the Lightning, consistently demonstrated intercept performance that American and West German fighter pilots found difficult to counter. The climb rate was the decisive factor. An F-104 starfighter pilot attempting to bounce a Lightning from altitude discovered with some frequency that the Lightning had already arrived at his altitude and was sitting on his 6 o'clock before the engagement had properly begun. Roland Beaumont flew the Lightning against American fighters on comparative trials. The results were not publicized in detail. They did not need to be. The American pilots who flew against it knew what they had encountered. Then came the export chapter, and with it one of the more unexpected dimensions of the Lightning story. In 1966, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia placed an order for 34 Lightning F, 53 6T, 55 two-seat trainers supplemented by a subsequent order that brought the total to 46 aircraft. Kuwait ordered 12 Lightning F-53 Estes and 2T, 55 SES. The export variants were the most capable Lightnings built, combining the F-6's enlarged fuel tankage with a ground attack capability that the RAF's own interceptor variants had never required. They carried Matra rocket pods and 1,000-pound bombs in addition to the Red Top missiles. They were in many respects more versatile than the aircraft the RAF was operating at the same time. The Saudi and Kuwaiti Lightnings were operated under British contract support with BAC engineers and seconded RAF personnel maintaining them at Riyadh and at Ahmed Al-Jabba Air Base respectively. Whether the Kuwaiti Lightnings saw operational use during regional tensions of the late 1960s and early 1970s remains a matter of incomplete record. Kuwaiti government sources have made occasional references to operational sorties. The full picture remains classified. What is not classified is the economic significance of the export orders. The Saudi and Kuwaiti contracts, valued at approximately £100 million combined, roughly £1.8 billion today, sustained BAC's Wharton production line through a period when domestic RAF orders were tapering. Without the export program, Lightning production would almost certainly have ended several years earlier than it did. But even as the export line ran at Wharton, the signs at home were unmistakable. The 1957 Defense White Paper, authored by Minister of Defense Duncan Sandys, had declared that the era of the manned fighter was effectively over, that surface-to-air missiles would replace interceptor aircraft as the primary air defense weapon. The Lightning was already in development and was exempted from the resulting cancellations. But the White Paper's logic poisoned the well for everything that might have followed. No successor program was seriously funded. No next-generation British supersonic fighter entered development. The Lightning, almost from the moment it entered service, was flying without a credible successor on the drawing board. The F-6, the final and most capable RAF variant, entered service with 5 Squadron at Binbrook in 1965 and with 11 Squadron shortly after. It was a better aircraft than the F-1 in almost every measurable respect: more fuel, better missiles, improved radar in some fits. But it was still fundamentally the same design that had first flown in 1954. A decade of incremental improvement had not resolved the range problem, the two-missile armament, or the absence of any beyond visual range weapons capability. By the late 1960s, Whitehall had already made its decision. The Lightning would not be replaced by a British aircraft. It would be replaced by the McDonnell Douglas F-4 Phantom II, re-engined with Rolls-Royce Spey turbofans for British service at considerable additional cost, but American in every essential dimension. The Treasury's arithmetic was on its own terms, straightforward. The Phantom could carry more missiles, fly further, and operate in the strike role as well as the intercept role. Its unit cost spread across a larger production run, shared with the United States Navy and Marine Corps, was lower than any British alternative could have achieved. What the Treasury's arithmetic did not capture because it had no column, for it was what Britain was giving up by never building the Lightning's successor itself. That accounting would come later, and it would be expensive. The Lightning did not die in a single afternoon the way the TSR-2 did. There was no Commons statement, no minister rising to announce the figure, no single moment when the door closed and the lights went out. It died slowly, by committee, by omission, by the steady accumulation of decisions that were never quite described as decisions. Budget revisions that deferred development procurement choices, that assumed a successor was coming, and a succession of defense reviews that treated the Lightning as a temporary measure, even as it became year by year a permanent one. The process had begun in truth before the aircraft entered service. Duncan Sandys's 1957 Defense White Paper had declared the manned interceptor obsolete. The logic was not entirely without merit. Surface-to-air missile technology was advancing, and the cost of maintaining a large fighter force was rising. But the White Paper's conclusions outran the evidence. Missiles in 1957 could not operate in all weathers, could not engage low-level targets reliably, and could not be repositioned to respond to a changing threat axis. The manned interceptor was not obsolete. It was irreplaceable. And the Lightning entering service 3 years later proved it every time a QRA scramble went to cockpit readiness at Low Chars in a North Sea winter storm. But the damage was done. The 1957 paper had killed the follow-on programs before they could begin. The Saunders Roe SR-177, a mixed-power interceptor combining a Bristol Siddeley Orpheus turbojet with a rocket motor for exceptional climb performance, which had attracted serious interest from both the RAF and the West German Luftwaffe, was cancelled in 1957, a direct casualty of the Sandys logic. The P-17 English Electric's own supersonic development study that might have evolved into a Lightning successor with genuine beyond visual range capability and extended range received no development funding. It remained a study. Then it became a file. Then it became nothing. Through the early 1960s, the ministry examined several possible Lightning replacements. The Anglo-French variable geometry aircraft, a collaboration with France that would eventually evolve through a series of reconfigurations and compromises into the Seppicat Jaguar, and later the Panavia Tornado, was never going to be a pure interceptor. The American F-111K was ordered in 1966 as part of a broader procurement package, then cancelled in 1968 when the defense budget contracted again, leaving a gap that the Phantom was hastily promoted to fill. The pattern was becoming familiar. Britain ordered American. Britain cancelled American. Britain ordered American again. The decision to purchase the F-4 Phantom II for RAF and Royal Navy service was announced in 1965. The aircraft would be built in Seine. Louis shipped to the United Kingdom and re-engined with Rolls-Royce Spey turbofans at considerable industrial effort and additional cost, a compromise designed to preserve some British industrial content in the transaction. The Spey installation proved more complex than anticipated. The modifications required to accommodate the wider Spey engine actually degraded the Phantom's top speed compared to the American version, while adding development cost and schedule delay. Britain had paid to make an American aircraft slightly worse. The first Phantoms entered RAF service in 1969. At RAF, Gütersloh, 19 Squadron and 92 Squadron, the Lightning squadrons on NATO's Central Front began converting to the Phantom in 1974. The Lightnings they handed back were in several cases aircraft with significant airframe life remaining. They were not worn out. They were simply no longer convenient. At Binbrook in Lincolnshire, 5 Squadron and 11 Squadron held on. For 14 more years, the 2 Binbrook squadrons kept the Lightning flying in British service long after the Phantom had taken over the Germany role, long after the Tornado F-3 had been identified as the eventual replacement, long after the aircraft had been officially categorized as an interim measure. Spare parts became scarce. BAC had closed the production line. Components had to be sourced from retired airframes from the Saudi maintenance contract, occasionally from remarkably creative engineering solutions developed by the ground crew at Binbrook, whose commitment to the aircraft outlasted the ministry's interest in supporting it properly. The final NATO Central Front Lightning sortie was flown in 1974. The Binbrook wing continued, but the end, when it came, arrived with the bureaucratic finality that the Lightning had always deserved to avoid. The Tornado F-3 entered service. The schedule was set. The mathematics were simple. 5 Squadron disbanded on 31st December 1987. 11 Squadron flew its last Lightning sortie on the 30th of April 1988. The aircraft was withdrawn from RAF service after 28 years. It had outlasted every aircraft that had been described at various points in its career as its replacement. The F-111K was gone. The P-17 had never existed. The Phantom itself was already aging. What the Lightning left behind was not merely a gap in the order of battle. It was a more fundamental absence. The capability it had demonstrated the ability to climb faster, intercept earlier, and engage higher than any comparable aircraft had been achieved by British engineers in a British factory on a British budget. The knowledge that produced it lived in the drawing offices at Wharton, in the test pilot's reports from Boscombe Down, in the engineering notebooks of Frederick Page's design team. Some of that knowledge transferred in part into the Tornado program, a European collaboration that diluted British engineering authority, even as it preserved some British industrial participation. But Britain would never again design and build a supersonic fighter alone. The last development study that might have kept that capability alive, the P-11, 5-4, a supersonic vertical takeoff fighter that Hawker had proposed as a Lightning successor with Mach 2 performance and VTOL capability, was cancelled in February 1965, the same month that the Phantom purchase was announced. The two decisions arrived together. One door closed, another opened onto an American production line. The Sandys White Paper. The P-17 study that went nowhere. The F-111K that was ordered and cancelled. The P-1154 that was cancelled and replaced. The Phantom that cost more than it should have and performed slightly less than it might have. Each decision followed logically from the last. Each one made the next one harder to avoid. The production line at Wharton closed. The drawing offices were reassigned. The engineers retired or moved on. And at Binbrook on the last day of April 1988, a Lightning F-6 lifted off the runway for the final time in RAF. Service climbed to altitude at a rate no other British aircraft has matched before or since, and turned for home. The Lightning has been gone from RAF service for nearly 4 decades. And yet the questions it raises have never quite gone away. Not the technical questions, those were answered decisively on runways at Boscombe Down and Luchars and Gütersloh by pilots who flew the aircraft against everything NATO and the Warsaw Pact could put in the air. The Lightning was faster. It climbed harder. It arrived first. On those counts, the verdict was never seriously in dispute. The questions that remain are institutional. They belong to Whitehall, to the Treasury, and to the succession of defense reviews that treated British aerospace capability as a cost to be managed rather than a strategic asset to be sustained. What the Lightning demonstrated between 1954 and 1988 was that Britain possessed the engineering knowledge, the industrial infrastructure, and the test and evaluation apparatus to design and build a world-class supersonic interceptor from first principles. English Electric had done it on a development budget that the American defense procurement system would have considered inadequate for a feasibility study. Frederick Page's team had solved without American assistance the aerodynamic propulsion and systems integration problems that defined supersonic fighter design in the 1950s. That knowledge did not simply evaporate when the Wharton production line closed, but it dispersed, it aged. It was not renewed because no successor program existed to renew it. The engineers who had designed the Lightning's stacked engine installation, who had solved its intake geometry, who had developed its reheat sequencing logic, those men retired through the 1970s and 1980s. Their notebooks went into archives, Their experience went with them. When Britain eventually joined the Eurofighter Typhoon program, a four-nation collaboration with Germany, Italy, and Spain that produced a genuine fourth-generation multi-role fighter, British industry contributed a substantial share of the airframe and systems work. BAE Systems built the forward fuselage and the leading-edge slats. Rolls-Royce co-developed the EJ-200 engine. The British industrial thread survived, transformed, and diluted into the 21st century. But the Typhoon is not a British aircraft in the sense that the Lightning was a British aircraft. The decisions made between 1957 and 1965, the Sandys White Paper, the cancelled P-17, the abandoned P-1154, the purchased Phantom, ensured that it could never be. The human footnote that the Lightning story demands belongs not to a designer or a minister, but to a test pilot, Roland Beaumont. Wing Commander, Roland Prosper. Beaumont, CBEDSO and BAR. DFC and BAR flew the Lightning's first flight in August 1954 and remained its most eloquent public advocate for the remainder of his life. He had flown Hurricanes in the Battle of France, Typhoons in the low-level attack role over occupied Europe, and Tempests in the defense of London against one-flying bombs. He was one of the most decorated and most experienced combat pilots Britain produced in the Second World War. After the war, he became English Electric's chief test pilot. He flew the Canberra's first flight in 1949. He flew the Lightning's first flight in 1954. He flew the TSR-2's first flight in 1964. Three of the most significant British military aircraft of the post-war era, and Beaumont was at the controls for the first flight of each one. When the TSR-2 was cancelled in April 1965, Beaumont was reported to have wept. Not publicly, but those who worked alongside him at Wharton described a man who understood with precise engineering clarity exactly what had been lost, and exactly how unnecessary the loss had been. He continued to write and speak about British aviation history until his death in 2001 at the age of 79. He never stopped arguing that Britain had possessed in the Lightning and the TSR-2 the foundation of an independent world-class combat aviation capability, and that the decisions of the 1960s had dismantled that foundation deliberately, incrementally, and without fully understanding what they were destroying. The procurement historians who have examined the Lightning program in subsequent decades have reached conclusions that are, by the measured standards of academic defense analysis, unusually direct. The aircraft's fundamental limitations, short-range minimal armament, absence of beyond visual range capability, were not inherent to the design. They were the consequence of funding decisions made at the development stage when the cost of addressing them would have been modest. By the time the operational deficiencies became impossible to ignore, the cost of correcting them had grown beyond what any single development cycle could absorb. The Lightning flew its entire career as a less capable aircraft than it needed to be, not because English Electric had failed, but because the ministry had declined to fund success all the way to its conclusion. The National Audit Office has never produced a specific retrospective on the Lightning program in the manner it examined later procurement failures. But the pattern it represents, a technically successful system underfunded at the development stage, then replaced by an imported alternative at greater long-term cost to British industrial capability, recurs with sufficient frequency in post-war British defence procurement to constitute something close to a doctrine. It is not a doctrine anyone wrote down. It did not need to be. If you found this history valuable, give the video a like. It is the single best signal you can send this channel. And if you want more stories about the aircraft, ships, and decisions that shaped British military power, subscribe to UK Defence Archive. We'll see you in the next one. At RAF. Binbrook on the morning of the 30th of April. 1988, the last Lightning F6 on RAF charge rolled to the threshold of runway 21, lit both Avons in full reheat, and climbed away from Lincolnshire at a rate no British aircraft has matched since accelerating through 40,000 feet in under 3 minutes alone above the cloud, going faster than anything else in the sky.